Good evening, everyone. So tonight we're going to talk about how deep is the gold. It's a topic that, here we go again, came up from the HQ. So if you want to join us, I'm Prospector Jess. I'm here to help you find more gold. I have a blog site called Hunting for Gold. That's number 4, GOLD, and .com. And I also have another blog site called sourdoughminer.com. Look up both of those sites. All kinds of information on gold and gold prospecting and videos and articles and things like that, as well as there's some things in the top bar that are products and interesting information, as well as my newsletter that you can sign up for. And basically, what we're going to talk about tonight is an interesting topic. It came up from the Gold Prospectors HQ here on Facebook. That's our group. You should join that as well. Got lots of things for you to do tonight, okay, especially if you're new. Even if you're old, not so new. So if you have ever looked at gold and wondered, or at a prospecting location, and say you're sampling, and you get this feeling like, am I there yet? So tonight will maybe strike you a little bit of deja vu, because what we're going to be talking about is kind of why gold at depth might vary from the standards, what people consider to be the normal process for gold, of course, which is go to bedrock. I say it all the time. So gold, PJ's rule, gold rolls downhill, downstream, down to bedrock. Now, each one of those journeys, each one of those pathways is fraught with all kinds of physical phenomena that can alter the reality from expectations. In engineering, we call them assumptions. We also had a phrase that said something like, you know what an assumption is? If you say assume, it means you're making an ASS out of you and me, okay? And so the thing we're trying to do here is point out why those assumptions might be not false, but faulty. You see, engineering assumptions are only as good as the information you have, as well as perhaps some of the other things you have around the environment you're dealing with. And it is not at all uncommon in real-world experience. This is why I love engineering, because it's the real-life application of science. You see, we don't necessarily get stuck in that rut trying to prove something that's really difficult to prove with respect to climate or geology even, okay? It becomes very difficult to prove the temperature or the pressure that a particular rock was made at. We can make analogs to it. I don't have a problem with that at all. I mean, we can make man-made diamonds. We can certainly make man-made rocks. The problem is we have no way of really making them the way they were made because we don't have rock generators the size of the Sierra Nevada. We don't have all kinds of things like that with respect to weather either. So when we come down to weather, and that is a little bit of tonight's subject, the conundrum becomes, well, what kind of weather? What kind of weather moves gold? Because we've talked about this before. When you're talking about those 3 paths, downhill, downstream, down to bedrock, okay? Now, first thing, the origin. Well, that's that business with all the geology and the rocks and minerals and where they got stuck and how they got generated, whether the rocks they're with. So that all defines whether they break out and how they break out and what kind of toughness they are when they break out. And what other materials might be with them that might help free the gold. Okay, so that's one part of the journey. The second part is that down the hill. That down the hill thing, you might think as well, it just pops out of the rock and starts rolling. Guess again, okay? Weather. Same stuff that you require in the stream, you require on the hillsides. If you've ever looked at a flash flood and looks at rocks and gullies and hillsides, you'll see things called landslides. You'll see things called flash floods. You'll see all kinds of things that have to do with the artifacts left over from those, such as deep cut gullies and washes, as well as big, huge boulders and cracked and fractured material left over from what was once there, including trees that have fallen and been ripped out by their roots and taken downstream. All of that stuff is part of, and don't forget the occasional volcano with its lahar. You may not know what a lahar is. A lahar is basically a massive, massive mud flow that occurs in a very short order. We're talking minutes, because of the huge temperature rises that occur during a volcanic eruption. You see, volcanoes tend to be tall, so they tend to be coated with ice. That ice is water in solid form. What makes it not solid? Well, heat. Where does the heat come from? Well, in a volcanic eruption, it comes from the stuff that comes up. And it doesn't necessarily have to hit the surface to cause it to boil. Just ask the trout that were in a couple, I think it was Cowlitz Creek in Oregon before Mount St. Helens blew. The water started boiling and the fish started jumping out on the banks. If you ever see something like that, run the heck out of there, because that's not a good sign. That's a sign things are not getting good underground. But it also means that the ice will start to melt as a sheet, and typically melt from the bottom out. And so what happens is, as it does, it gets freed up from the slopes and starts to slide across even hotter material. Pretty soon, the ice and the slurry of water that's underneath it and the rocks and minerals and ash from previous volcanic eruptions combine with all the other junk, and you get this thing that looks like concrete moving downhill at not quite the speed of sound, but pretty darn fast. And guess what happens is it actually traps air underneath it and rides on that jacket of air, and that air can hit the speed of sound and blow things down, but the lahar itself will come down and tear out everything down below and leave all kinds of deposits down there of whatever minerals were on the side of the volcano. Okay, but here's the deal. That's just yet another kind of water flow and mud flow that can move gold down those slopes. Okay, that's not to say every slope has a volcano. They certainly don't. But the water is what makes it flow. And when the water cuts loose and gets enough flow, it will move things. It will move large objects very fast, and it will cut deeply into the canyons and gravel piles and whatever else is in there. And that's what tonight's discussion is going to be about. We're going to talk about, well, what exactly does that water do? We've talked about that before. I'm going to kind of quickly talk about that topic, and then we're going to dive deep. We're going to talk about why sometimes it doesn't behave the way it should. There are reasons, and some of them are obvious, some are not. And many of them are kind of difficult to understand. Okay, so let's move on to the page. Make sure we got our audio going, because I'm going to be on a roll here in a second. I'm going to go for the chalkboard again. How's everybody doing? Are we staying compliant? There's a word. Are we happy? Well, I'm glad you're here tonight, because we get a chance to be relieved from all of this other garbage that's going out there. But hey, you see that? That's a rock tumbler, a big one. 8.5 gallon rock tumbler. It's only $1,274.68. I wonder where they came up with the 68 cents. But anyway, rock tumblers come in handy under some situations. Okay. Right now, we're going to talk mostly about the concept of digging deep and trying to get to bedrock, and or trying to understand what the gold lead is telling us. Remember, we talked about sampling at different levels, and you guys are starting to do it, and I'm starting to hear the, are we there yet? Which is exactly what I hope to hear, you see. Because when we're busy trying to dig to bedrock, on the journey, sometimes we run into head scratchers. That's okay. Head scratchers are good. Here's what I want you to do. Persevere. Get through with it. Come on, kids. Quiet down. Okay? Just wait. It'll be worth it. When we get to the water park, Gold Park, okay, it'll all be worth it. Even if we don't find anything, it'll still all be worth it. Trust me. But the difficulty is, are we there yet? It happens again, because at every layer, it seems like it ought to be over by now. And, oh, by the way, we quit seeing gold a while back. Now, that's what brought up tonight's discussion. We quit seeing gold about 3 layers ago, translation about 6 hours ago. And we go, now, there is a question that you should ask, and we talked about this the other night. When do you quit? Mine or move on? Well, in sampling, it's a little different. Sampling is a different kind of thing than mining. Believe it or not. Sampling, you really ideally want to get to that bedrock at all costs, but sometimes it's just too friggin' deep. Okay, it's just way down there, and we misidentified how deep it was. And that's why you want to kind of look at the fringes and see where there might be protrusions of bedrock that would give you an idea of the slope, because that'll help you understand how deep it might be, as well as, if you can, some kind of a probe that you can go down in there. Now, I know of people have told me probes don't all work. Well, I know they don't, but the fact is, beats the poke in the eye of the sharp stick. I don't know. It is a way, a method to kind of gauge whether you should continue or not. If I found several probe spots where it seemed to be, this follows with the slope I'm seeing over there, and it's down only 5 more feet, I'd say, okay, then we're going to go 5 more feet, because we're going to go to that level. It might have to go much deeper because of the slope, but that's a different discussion. Right now, we're just making a vertical hole, and we want to sample all the layers in that hole that we can to understand where and what kind of gold, what colors we're finding, the fineness and the quality of the gold. Is it rich, or is it silvery or mercury coated? Is it, what has it got that tells us the story? And then we're putting that in our log, right? We write that stuff down so we can track what we found, where we found it, and how much work it was to find it, because that's all part of the big picture. How many yards did we move? The whole discussion in the HQ about yards and buckets is pretty good. You should go look it up. Yeah, you should go look it up. It's interesting, people, gallons and yards and buckets. It's an interesting set of measurements. I get into it with hydropower, because hydropower, you measure everything in cubic feet per second or cubic meters per second, and you have to convert between cubic meters and cubic feet, and there's 27 of those and one of those, and it's but it all comes down to energy in the end. Well, in our case, it all comes down to gold in the end, but it's gold per how much stuff did you move? And you'll see a bit of that tonight, because I'm going to poke at it some. It's fun. When we work these holes and we're sampling, it seems futile, maybe. Or maybe not. Some of you guys might get your... never mind. I don't want to go there. I'm not going to go there. You might have a lot of fun digging rocks out of holes. It's okay. I tend to find it arduous, but when I'm finding the good stuff, or when I'm on the hunt for it, it doesn't bother me. And what I usually have a problem with is more akin to Facebook. I get distracted. Oh, look, a shiny thing over here. Look, oh, that's ultramafic this and that. And so that becomes a different kind of problem. Dad, put the rock down and get back to panning, get back to digging, get back to dredging, whatever you were doing, get back to it. The rock's fine, but put it in your bucket of rocks. And so tonight we're going to poke at what happened to the gold when we were going down looking for it. How deep is that gold? Or are we there yet? That's AKA, are we there yet? And so I wanted to show you a little bit about that. Let's first check to make sure we got our audio. Audio, video. Here we go. Refresh the screen. Drum roll, please. Yes, we are live, and there are 47 people on board. Welcome. So, as we start digging down to gold or to bedrock, take your pick, or both, hopefully, okay, we are going to be on a journey. That journey will go through several passages and several layers that will be a bit like the Twilight Zone at times. And that's okay, because here's the thing I want you to think about. Why would you not see gold as one continuous vertical gradient, ever increasing in gold concentration as you go from top to bottom? What would stop that from happening? I want some answers. Put them in the comments below. Okay, so the idea is, we might think that, well, the light stuff's going to be on top, because we talked about this. The light stuff's the last stuff to settle out in a flood, and the heavier stuff tends to be the thing that's at the bottom when everything gets scrubbed to bedrock. And so we should see this nice even gradient where we go fine, coarse gold, a little chunkier gold, a little more nuggetized gold, and then the mother lode, the great big, look, I got this Idaho potato-sized nugget, okay? And the answer is, well, doesn't quite work that way. And that's what we're going to poke at tonight. We're going to poke at it right now. Let's make sure we got everything It's the mileage, not the age, says James Sinclair. Yes, that is correct. Had a great weekend at Alabama Gold Camp. Still working on my concentrates, says Thomas Chris Wilson. Awesome. That's fun. Richard Bevan says, I move rock to find gold, so I free it to my pan. That's a good attitude. So you're basically freeing gold from its prison in the rocks and cobbles around it. Lynn Yarnell says, I love the subject tonight. Awesome. Okay, so, and Lori from Vegas says it sounds great. So we're going to roll with this. Here we go. Whiteboard time, or chalkboard, actually it's blackboard. So when we look at our sample hole, I'm going to do this one with the right colors. I'm going to start off with my red first. And I have this place where I'm in a creek bed and looks something like that. So that's the surface. And I started working it. And on the top of that was my summer flow, which, you know, kind of runs across here like this. And I always have this slurpy derpies across the top. Now the winter flow was way the heck up there somewhere, okay? And that's something we'll get to in a second here. So winter flow is coming through like a torrent. Summer flow, not so much. And we decide, well, you know, I'm finding a little bit of gold down in these pockets here. And here. And so flash in the pan. I find some gold dust and some small little tiny pickers. Flood gold, okay? And I start asking myself, okay, well then there's flood gold. I'm at the top of what will be this awesome column of gold, perfectly uniform. The term we use in science is homogeneous, okay? It simply means it's all alike. It's all mixed real well together. So it's actually not homogeneous is what we'd be thinking. It's more like a gradient. It just increases in the amount of gold until we get to the bottom. It might follow some exponential. That'd be nice, huh? But more and more gold as we go. But then we start digging down here, and all of a sudden we find this patchy layer in here where we find some really good concentrations of that same kind of flood kind of gold. And then we get below that, so I'm digging this hole to, you know, China. I'm going to mark it with green. And so I'm just working this sample hole down through all this material because those are the spots I decided to work, and I'm just working my way down. And the question is, okay, what's down here? How deep is the gold? Well, we found this band, and so that gave us some excitement. And we found the pieces in the top, which got us started. And so we must be on the pay streak, right? Well, not necessarily, you see. Not necessarily. So then I come down below this level and I start digging through it, and I encounter this situation where I find maybe 2 particles of gold in my pans. And then I'm digging to China. And I get down in here and I still haven't hit the bottom yet, and I find a couple more particles. And so there must be lots, but you know what? It seems to have cut out. What's the story? What's going on here? Well, you see, when floods happen, we'll go back to water movement. When floods happen, this thing basically gets ripped up, and in different seasons, the ripping occurs in different ways. Now, this is just one set of dimensions. There's a 3-dimensional, actually 4-dimensional picture that we're drawing tonight. And it's going to be a little hard for PJ to draw. I'm good at drawing some things, 2 dimensions mainly. When I get to 3 dimensions, it kind of looks a little lame, especially with the computer, because I can't get my hands to draw. But when we're going to draw in 4 dimensions, it's almost impossible. So I'm going to ask you to visualize in your head for a second. And the visualization is going to be that I'm going to draw some lines in a sequence. And I want you to think about what they mean in the context of the prospect we're working over time. The prospect or the hole that we're digging and what it must have done over time, okay? Because this is the important lesson for the evening. So as time rolls on, I'm going to paint in purple some profiles. So last season we had some interesting storms, and it cut a groove and kind of came down through here, and basically, so that's season 1.0, okay? And so basically it brought in 2 chunks of gold and got me on the pay streak that I thought I had. Now, were those chunks related to the gold below it or not? See where I'm going? So now I have, if I go back 10 years and I find that there was this major flood 10 years ago and it cut down below this level to about here. Now that's 2. That's maybe 20 years ago. That's my 20-year flood. I'm going to mess up PJ here in a second. PJ, sorry, you got to move. That's a really bad 20, but you get the idea. 20, okay? 20. Starting to look like 70 or Zorro. So 20 years ago, there was a major flood, came through this region, and it cut things up pretty badly. It also tended to cut into some other zones that had gold buried in them and rearranged them, kind of just dusted the whole area and left that mark. See what's happening? Now, I'm going to give you a hint, if I can find my hint. My Hint-O-Matic 9000 here. Where are you little booger? You know, props are never where they're supposed to be because they get used for other stuff like the real thing they're intended. Oh, heck. There it is. This gadget is a digital recorder, okay? That's how I do field recordings for audio for gold hunting expeditions, okay? So this field recorder is the digital version of a reel-to-reel. Now, why did I bring that up? Well, because when audio is produced, you may not know this, but it's produced in layers, okay? Typically, for a musical thing, it's, 16 track is small. It might be 32 or 100 tracks. Depends on how complicated the music is and how many different parts there are and how you have to get them adjusted relative to one another and how you clean them up, especially in the digital world. You can do all kinds of fancy stuff, clean them or garbageify them. Garbageify them, I made that word up. Okay, there are filters called grunge, believe it or not. You put stuff in and garbage comes out because that's music to some people. Okay, it's music to some people's ears. But the point is that all those layers are put down separately and have a relationship to one another. Well, the same thing holds true here. That's what this is just simply an analogy to a tape recorder that's been collecting gold as a track, like a multi-track recorder over time. Track 1 was that top one, happened a year or so ago. Track 2 was that 20-year-old flood. And track 3 is the one I want you to pay much attention to because track 3 is going to be really, really interesting. Track 3 goes, and then it just rips all the way to bedrock, okay? That's why I keep saying that. But that was 100 years ago. See where we're going? Or more. Might have been 1,000 years ago. It just depends on where you are. But a 100-year flood or 200-year flood is the thing we're looking for when we're talking about moving serious gold. Why? 1, it has the volumetric equivalent in terms of power and energy to move larger gold. 2, it has the ability to cut through all the layers above. That's why gold doesn't show up as one big column. It's a recording that goes year to year, just keeps going layer and layer and then it cuts through again and replays and then cuts through again. And so we don't get nice, even homogeneous columns. We get little dashes and hints in the columns that we're intercepting. And that's why I keep telling you, you really want to go down to bedrock and you want to sample the levels as you go and watch for bands of black sands, garnets, anything that might tell you, lead. I'll show you a picture, okay? Iron. You see, when you start seeing that stuff, it's got to go in your log. And what level was it at? Why? Because what you're doing is you're decoding the recording. You're playing it back. And as you do, think outside the box. If I start finding a band of this stuff that looks pretty solid, and it seems to be kind of, it has this kind of appearance as though it's really, we know kind of the direction it's headed in, and we can kind of see some other things. There are other things that would tell you about the direction of the flow. Then I'm going to be working at that level a lot more. And I might be using particular equipment at that level a lot. stuff for fines or coarse or, you name it, okay? And so the whole idea here is I'm simply sampling, and that's why sampling is so important. I'm sampling to identify the old recording, the historic, the ancient flows of gold's past. Because the ancient flows of gold's past tell you where to find it in the future. Now, what does that all mean? Well, it means that when it's scrubbed it way to the bottom, what you might be seeing is just hints of where the gold had been from previous flows or energies released, but the big stuff is down here. Now, it might even be below this level because of cracks and fissures, okay? You might even find a pocket. Here's an interesting, did you know that fine gold and even some coarse gold can be packed into a pocket through a crack? This is a fissure into what's called a voug. A voug is simply an opening inside of a rock. So let's say we have some kind of internal vessel, some place where the rock opened up and either different rocks, kind of collected around it, boulders, and pinned in an opening down in there. But there's only a little tiny orifice feeding it. Gold is incredibly malleable and can be ground extremely fine. Those two things come into play when boulders whack on it and push it through that hole, and it basically goes in there and deforms and starts to fill that voug. It can actually pack in tight enough to push out the other particles of sand and gravels out of there, and what you end up with is a tiny little pocket placer internal to the rock. And the only way to get at it is pop that rock open, crevice, but a little deeper than typical crevicing. You're not just using a crevicing tool, you're opening up the rock to find the vougs inside. So what happens is this area that we're talking about has gold concentrating in it, but we don't see any hints of it above because it was ripped apart 100 years ago, and then layers and layers and layers of recordings have been played out on top of it. And so we don't get to see this recording unless we pretend we're at a 100-year flood stage and we get to this bottom level. That's why I keep pushing. You got to go to bedrock. Now, are you guaranteed to find it? Nope. Nope, you're not. Okay? But the fact of the matter is that it would not be unusual to have this kind of situation play out where you just don't see it until you're down there. Now, you kind of want to see some hints of it.